In the endless flow of time, perhaps the only thing that never changes is change itself. Everything will eventually pass. Youth will fade into old age. Green leaves will turn yellow when autumn comes. And the breeze you feel today may carry a different scent tomorrow. We are born, we grow, we get old, we fall ill, and finally, we die. That is the law of life. No one can escape impermanence. Yet, amid this circle of birth, aging, sickness, and death, humans have always carried a silent question. Is there a path that can lead us beyond suffering? Is there a way to calm the restless mind so it no longer gets swept away by endless worries and fears? In other words, what does enlightenment truly mean? Some may think enlightenment is a rare, mystical state, something that belongs only to sages and saints, something that requires years of meditation, hours of sitting still, or memorizing thousands of sutras. Others might believe enlightenment is simply out of reach for ordinary people. They may say, that's for the monks, the scholars, the ones who have shaved their heads and left the world behind. And for the rest of us, we just need to survive each day. 3 meals a day is enough. But is that really true? If awakening is something only monks can touch, what about the millions of people out there, working, struggling, raising families, living ordinary lives? Is enlightenment really so far away? Or is it perhaps just a different way of seeing? Maybe it's not about climbing to the top of a mountain. Maybe it's just breathing differently, pausing for a moment, letting go of the grasping and realizing things have always been this way, and there's nothing more to hold on to. In the history of Buddhism, there was one person who answered this question, not by preaching, not by writing books, not by performing miracles. He answered it by living his life, quietly and humbly. That person was Master Huineng, the Sixth Patriarch of Chinese Zen Buddhism. He did not come from a wealthy family. He never learned to read or write. He did not memorize long sutras, nor did he spend his life debating philosophy. Yet, he became one of the most important figures in Zen history. He opened a new door to meditation, a way of seeing that is simple, direct, and close to everyday life. To understand his path, let's travel back to China over 300 years ago during the Tang Dynasty in the 7th century. At that time, China was flourishing. The Silk Road connected the capital of Chang'an to the western regions, bringing goods, ideas, and religions. Buddhism had already been in China for more than 600 years. It had grown powerful with hundreds of temples and thousands of monks. Sutras had been translated from Sanskrit into Chinese. Scholars and monks spent their days studying and lecturing. But as Buddhism spread, it also began to divide. Some focused on chanting and rituals, some on strict meditation. Others spent years studying scriptures, dissecting every word. People started to argue about the right way to practice. Should one meditate quietly? Should one follow precepts strictly? Or should one study the text day and night? And right in the middle of all this complexity, there appeared a very unusual person, a woodcutter, an illiterate man, someone who did not know even a single sutra by heart. But somehow, he would open a new path, a path that points directly to the heart without relying on words or rituals. Master Huineng was born in the year 638 during the reign of Emperor Taizong of the Tang Dynasty. His hometown was Tunhung in Guangzhou, today known as Guangdong Province. He was born into poverty. His father died when he was still very young. His mother struggled to raise him alone, and as soon as he could, Master Huineng went into the mountains to cut firewood. Day after day, he carried bundles of wood down to the market to trade for rice and oil so he and his mother could survive. He never learned to read or write. He had no teacher to show him scriptures. No one taught him Buddhist chants. But there are some things in life that don't require books to understand. Many times while chopping wood in the forest, Master Huineng would stop for a while, look up at the drifting clouds, listen to the falling leaves, and quietly wonder to himself, where does life really lead to? After all of this, what remains? Maybe in those simple moments, the seeds of awakening were already beginning to grow. One day, while carrying firewood to the market, Master Huineng heard someone chanting a sutra by the roadside. It was the Diamond Sutra, one of the core teachings of Mahayana Buddhism. The man recited a line that stopped Master Huineng in his tracks. "Let your mind arise, but do not let it dwell anywhere." That single sentence struck his heart like a sudden breeze clearing away the mist. He didn't understand all the words, but something deep inside him awakened. It was like someone had knocked on a door that had been closed for a long time, and now that door had quietly opened. Master Huineng returned home and told his mother, "I want to search for the way. I want to know why people suffer and how they can be free from suffering." His mother understood. She agreed. Soon after, Master Huineng arranged for someone to care for his mother, and then he left. This was not an ordinary journey. From Guangdong, he traveled across rivers and mountains, more than 1,000 miles on foot, heading north to Mount Huangmai, where Master Huineng, the Fifth Patriarch, was teaching. They say he walked barefoot, carrying only a wooden staff. The road was long and dangerous, but inside his heart, there was something even stronger than exhaustion, the longing to find the answer to life. At that time, Master Huineng was a famous Zen teacher. Hundreds of disciples came to study under him. Some were great scholars. Some were high officials seeking wisdom. When Master Huineng arrived, he did not ask to become a disciple right away. He simply asked to work in the monastery kitchen, to chop wood, to pound rice. Because he was from the southern region, and because he could not read, no one considered him a true student. But he did not mind. Day after day, Master Huineng quietly worked in the kitchen. At night, he would sit outside, listening to the teachings that drifted from the main hall. He listened with his heart. He did not need books. He did not need to chant sutras. He simply absorbed the teachings, breath by breath. In those silent days, something deep began to transform. From a simple kitchen worker, a small flame started to shine. Perhaps you're wondering, how could someone who could not read or write, someone pounding rice in the back of a monastery, become a great Zen master? What happened next? The famous verse competition, the split between the northern and southern schools, the secret transmission of the robe and bowl in the middle of the night. It all began from this humble moment. We'll continue this story in the next part. Some of life's biggest turning points do not come with loud drums or grand announcements. Sometimes change arrives quietly, like a breeze passing by, like a single verse written softly on a wall in the middle of the night. At Mount Huangmai, where Master Huineng was teaching, the monastery was always full of students. People came from everywhere. Some were government officials. Some were learned monks. Others were ordinary people, seeking a way to calm their hearts. Master Huineng was growing old. He knew the time was coming when he would need to pass on the robe and bowl, to choose the next patriarch, to hand over the lineage of Zen. But choosing the next successor was not about picking the most famous monk or the most educated. It was about finding the one who truly understood the heart of Zen. How could he know who had seen the way? Master Huineng chose a simple method. He told his students, "Each of you, write a verse on the wall. A verse that shows your understanding of practice. It didn't have to be long, just a few lines, enough to reveal your insight. Whoever could truly express the Dharma would be recognized." As soon as the news spread, the entire monastery whispered about it. Some wanted to write a verse, but soon everyone became silent. No one dared to go first. In the eyes of the disciples, there was one person who stood above the rest, the monk named Shenshu. Shenshu was the head monk. He was well respected, well educated, and skilled in teaching. Everyone believed he would surely be the next patriarch. So they waited. No one else wrote anything. Shenshu himself felt hesitant. He understood that this verse was not just a poem. It would decide the next leader of the Zen lineage. One night, when the monastery was asleep, Shenshu quietly picked up a brush and wrote his verse on the wall in the corridor. He wrote, The body is a Bodhi tree. The mind is like a bright mirror stand. Always keep it clean and polished. Do not let dust settle. The next morning, everyone saw the verse. They praised it. They thought this must be the verse of the next patriarch. Master Huineng also came to see. He nodded quietly. But then he said, "This verse shows some understanding, but it has not yet seen the true nature of mind. Leave it here for everyone to read and reflect." He did not criticize, but he also did not fully approve. While the whole monastery was talking about the verse, there was someone still working quietly in the kitchen. That person was Master Huineng. He listened to the verse being read out loud. He smiled gently. Then he spoke to the person beside him. "This verse does not reach the root. I also have a verse. Can you help me write it on the wall?" Because Master Huineng could not read or write, he had to ask someone to write it for him. And so another verse appeared, written quietly, without anyone knowing who it was from. The second verse said, "Bodhi has no tree. The bright mirror has no stand. Originally there is not a single thing. Where can dust gather?" This verse was completely different. It did not talk about cleaning the mirror. It did not speak of wiping away dust. Instead, it pointed directly to the source. Bodhi has no form. There is no actual mirror. Nothing has ever truly been born, so there is nothing to clean. There is no self to polish, and no dust to remove. When Master Huineng saw this verse, he immediately understood the writer had truly awakened. But to avoid causing trouble in the monastery, he did not openly praise it. That night, he quietly called Master Huineng to his room. In the stillness of the dark room, Master Huineng transmitted the teaching to Master Huineng. He explained the Diamond Sutra, line by line. When he reached the sentence, "Let your mind arise, but do not let it dwell anywhere," Master Huineng suddenly saw through everything. He spoke softly to Master Huineng. "I never knew my true nature was always pure. I never knew my true nature is beyond birth and death. I never knew my true nature is already complete. I never knew my true nature does not move. I never knew my true nature contains all things." In that moment, he realized the truth. Not through books, but by seeing directly into his own mind. Master Huineng knew Master Huineng had awakened. But he also knew that if he announced this publicly, it would cause great conflict. How could a southern man, a poor woodcutter who could not read, become the next patriarch? People would not accept it easily. So Master Huineng secretly passed on the robe and bowl to Master Huineng. Late at night, in silence, he told him, "This Dharma has always been transmitted quietly. Take the robe and bowl and go south. Protect the teaching. Do not stay here. People may become jealous." Master Huineng bowed in gratitude, and then he quietly left the monastery in the middle of the night. After that, just as Master Huineng had predicted, the other monks found out. Some became angry. Some even chased after Master Huineng, trying to take back the robe and bowl. They asked, "Who is he? A man who cannot read. How can he be the successor?" But Master Huineng simply smiled. He said, "The Dharma is about transmitting the mind, not about fighting over robes and bowls." He fled to the south, and for 15 years, he lived in hiding at a place called Tu Hoi in Hunan. He did not preach. He did not tell anyone he was the Sixth Patriarch. He lived as a simple woodcutter, blending in with the villagers. Yet even in hiding, the light of his awakening never faded. This is the spirit of sudden awakening, Dongo. Seeing directly into your true nature, not waiting for years of preparation, not thinking you must gather conditions first. Awakening happens now, in this very moment, not when you are old, not only after reading thousands of books. When you see directly into the mind, you are already free. 15 years passed quietly, like dew falling on leaves, making no sound, but nourishing the entire forest. And then one day, Master Huineng knew the time had come. It was time to step out of hiding. Time to share the light with others. We will continue that part of the story in the next episode. 15 years passed in quiet silence. Among the woodcutters in the forest, among the footsteps going back and forth by the riverside, no one knew that one of them was carrying the robe and bowl of Zen. Great Master Huineng lived like that. Simple, humble, hidden from the world. He did not preach. He did not debate. He never spoke of himself as the Sixth Patriarch. But time, like all things, has its natural flow. Like flowers blooming at the right season. Like clouds moving when the wind is just enough. One day Master Huineng knew. The moment had come. It was time to step out from hiding. It was time to carry the light that Master Hongren had entrusted to him and pass it on to the world. He left the village of Tu Hoi and began his journey of teaching. The first place he visited was the Temple of Great Brahma in Guangzhou. At that time, a well-known Dharma teacher was giving lectures on the Nirvana Sutra. The hall was full of people. Some were highly educated. Others were ordinary lay people. All sat quietly listening to the teachings. When Master Huineng arrived, he did not stand up to debate. He did not interrupt or challenge the teacher. He simply stood at the back of the hall, looking at the gathering, and gently asked a question. The Nirvana Sutra says that everyone possesses Buddha nature, but the Dharma teacher just said that we need to cultivate for a long time before we can see it. How is that so? The hall became silent. Master Huineng continued, his voice calm and clear. If Buddha nature is truly something we already have, then why say it takes a long time to find it? If we must wait, if we must gather more conditions, then is it really already there? The whole room fell quiet. It was like a cool breeze passing through a hot summer day. The Dharma teacher, after hearing Master Huineng's explanation, bowed and acknowledged that his understanding was deep and clear. From that moment on, news of Master Huineng began to spread. More and more people came to learn from him. But teaching for Master Huineng was never about giving long lectures. It was not about reciting book or performing grand ceremonies. He spoke simply, like a conversation over a cup of tea, like a gentle story shared between friends. One person asked, "Master, why does Zen say no reliance on written words?" Master Huineng smiled. No reliance on written words does not mean we reject words. It means we do not cling to them. We do not get stuck in language. Words are like a finger pointing to the moon. If you keep staring at the finger, you will forget to look at the moon. He explained further, the Dharma is not found in books alone. The Dharma is not outside of books either. The Dharma is right here, in your own mind. Another person asked, "Then, Master, how should we practice?" Master Huineng replied, "Do not search for the Buddha outside your own mind. Look directly into your heart. See your true nature clearly. That is already Buddha. This is what Zen calls directly pointing to the human mind. Nothing complicated. No layers of ritual. No need for long journeys." Someone else said, "But Master, my mind is still full of worries and distractions. How can I see my true nature right now?" Master Huineng smiled kindly. Sudden awakening means seeing it in this very moment. You do not need to wait for the right conditions. You do not need to prepare for years. It is like opening your eyes. The light is already there. There is no need to create the light. He said, when we are lost in delusion, Buddha comes to save sentient beings. But when we awaken, we realize sentient beings are already Buddha. That is the spirit of sudden awakening. You do not need to wait for tomorrow. You do not need to wait until you grow older. Right here, right now, if you can see into your true mind, that is already enlightenment. After teaching at the Temple of Great Brahma, the Sixth Patriarch Huineng went to Nanhua Temple. There he stayed for many years, and many people came to see him. Some of them were the same people who had once chased him, trying to take back the robe and bowl. Now they came back to apologize. They asked for forgiveness. But Master Huineng did not hold any grudges. He smiled and said, "The Dharma is for releasing attachments. not for keeping anger, and not for competition. He never asked whether a person was rich or poor. He never asked whether someone could read or not. To Master Huineng, everyone has Buddha nature. Everyone can awaken. All it takes is to turn inward, to look directly at your own mind. When you stop clinging to thoughts, the clear light of your true nature naturally appears. In the Platform Sutra, Master Huineng said, Buddha Dharma is here in this world. You do not need to leave the world to find awakening. That means you do not need to run away from life. You do not need to abandon your daily responsibilities. Right here in everyday life, when your heart is clear, when you live with mindfulness, that is already the way. Day after day, Master Huineng continued teaching at Nanhua Temple. He did not need to stand on a stage. He did not need fancy ceremonies. Sometimes it was just a few words shared under the temple eaves. Sometimes it was just a smile or a gentle reminder. These stories were later written down in the Platform Sutra. But more important than the book is the spirit behind it. The spirit of not clinging to forms. The spirit of not getting caught in names. Just live truly with your own mind. See your nature clearly. Let go of illusions. Those days passed peacefully. And then one day, great Master Huineng knew the time was coming when he would leave this world. He knew the day of his passing beforehand, like someone who knows a long journey is near. Calmly, without fear. But that is the story of the next part. We will continue together to listen to his final days in the next chapter. Sometimes we walk into a room and immediately sense the stillness there. No one needs to speak. Nothing needs to happen. It's just a space that allows the mind to soften and the heart to slow down. The story of the final days of great Master Huineng, the Sixth Patriarch of Zen, feels very much like that. There were no dramatic scenes, no sorrowful farewells. Just a person who had lived his life fully, quietly folding up his time here the way one gently folds a robe after wearing it. No attachment, no clinging. Master Huineng lived simply from the beginning. He was the boy who chopped wood to care for his mother. He was the one who received the robe and bowl in silence under the moonlight at Mount Huangmei. He was the man who spent 15 years in hiding and later the teacher who shared the Dharma openly at Nanhua Temple. Even at the end of his life, his spirit remained unchanged. Living and dying were just parts of the same journey. In the year 713, Master Huineng knew his time was coming. By then he was 76 years old. He gathered his disciples and gently spoke to them. It wasn't a heavy or solemn farewell. It was more like a father gently preparing his children for his departure. His voice was calm, just like any other day. He said, "Coming and going is the natural way. Do not let yourselves fall into sorrow when I leave. Keep your minds clear. Do not give rise to delusive thoughts." Some disciples knelt down, their eyes filled with tears. But Master Huineng smiled softly. He told them, "The Buddha is not far away. The Buddha is not up in the sky. The Buddha is within your own heart. When you let go of attachments, when you return to your original pure mind, you have already met the Buddha." He reminded them not to cling to forms. This body is temporary. Like a piece of clothing, you wear it for a while, then you take it off. Don't hold on to it. He repeated his final teaching, keep your minds clear. That is what truly matters. Then he sat quietly, in his familiar meditation posture, his legs crossed, his eyes half closed. And just like that, great Master Huineng peacefully left this world. No loud weeping, no cries of despair, because his disciples knew their teacher had departed freely, like a leaf falling in autumn, without struggle, without regret. After Master Huineng's passing, something unusual happened. His body did not decay as ordinary bodies do. His skin remained soft. His posture stayed upright. His face still looked serene, as if he were simply meditating. A gentle fragrance spread through the temple. People said that birds gathered silently in the courtyard. At midnight, some disciples heard the sound of the temple's wooden bell echoing on its own. These became stories told from generation to generation. Some believed it was a sign of awakening. Others called it a blessing. But before his passing, Master Huineng had already told them, "Do not turn my body into something to worship. Do not take this body as your refuge." He knew there would be people who clung to images, who would focus on forms. But what he wished to leave behind was the Dharma, not his body. His incorruptible body became a symbol of a life fully devoted to practice, a reminder of dedication, compassion, and letting go. Today, the body of the Sixth Patriarch Huineng is still kept at Nanhua Temple in Guangdong. After more than 300 years, with careful preservation, his form still sits there in full lotus posture, calm and gentle, as if he is still silently meditating. People from all over the world come to see it. Some stand before him and feel their hearts soften. Some cry quietly. Some simply bow and then walk away, feeling lighter than when they arrived. But the real treasure is not the sight of his body. It is the teachings he left behind. It is the reminder to return to the mind itself. Master Huineng often taught about life and death. To him, birth and death were not two different things. They are like someone walking into a house and then stepping out again, just changing places. Nothing to fear. He did not teach people to escape death, nor did he teach them to try to make life last forever. He simply taught, live fully in this moment. And when the time comes, let go gently. It is like holding a flower. When the flower wilts, you open your hand and let the wind carry it away. No grasping, no sorrow. That was his way. And even now, his story is not just a tale of the past. It is a soft reminder for anyone listening today. Awakening is not far away. It is not something to search for in the distant sky. It is not something you will find after you grow old or after you collect many teachings. Buddha nature is something we all have right now, even when you are busy working, even when you are cooking, even when you are sweeping the floor or driving on the road. All you need to do is pause for a moment, take one slow breath, and realize your mind is already clear and bright. That is awakening. It is not about becoming someone else. It is about returning to who you truly are. Let go of some of the worries. Release the need to chase after success and failure. Stop holding on so tightly to right and wrong. Live gently, softly, like the moon shining on the surface of a quiet lake, without ripples, without disturbance. Perhaps after listening to this story, you may not remember every detail. But what matters is keeping just a little stillness in your heart, so that when tomorrow comes and life gets busy again, you can remember the Buddha is not somewhere far away. The Buddha is within you. When you let go, when you return to your original pure mind, you have already met the Buddha, and that is enough.